Section 14 of Richelieu by George Joseph Gustave Masson. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 5, Foreign Policy, Part 3. Henceforth the defence of Paris was the all-engrossing topic. Following the cardinal's advice, Louis XIII. Sent for the chiefs of all the trade guilds, commanding them to meet him at the Louvre. He embraced them, and entrusted to them the protection of Paris. The enlisting of workmen took place at the town hall. Marshal de la Force organised the infantry, and the Duc d'Angoulême the cavalry. Rich people gave voluntary contributions. The corporation of haberdashers raised by itself a body of 350 soldiers. The Paris cobblers, proud of the reception made by His Majesty to their delegates, clubbed together and sent to the treasury a gift of 5,000 livres. The Parliament, in its turn, was summoned to assemble at the Louvre. "Gentlemen," said the king, "I have sent for you. You know the state of affairs. You are aware that the enemy is on our frontier. My good city of Paris has just given me proofs of its fidelity. My Parliament, I venture to believe, will not be behindhand in the discharge of its duty. I want the promise of the money to pay 2,000 infantry during 2 months. As soon as the army is assembled, I shall join it in person." The Parliament voted the required amount, but as it expressed the intention of seeing that the money should be well employed, the king replied sharply, "Gentlemen, meddle with the things alone which concern you. I shall govern my kingdom without your interference." As he had announced to the Parliament, Louis XIII. Took the field at the head of an army of 40,000 men, and was fortunate enough to drive the enemy from stage to stage as far as the boundaries of the kingdom. Richelieu, on his side, besieged Corbie and captured it in 10 days, 1636. Bussy-Raboutin's account deserves to be given here as the evidence of an eye-witness. At that time the affairs of the king went so badly in Picardy that His Majesty sent several times a message to the Prince de Condé, ordering him to abandon the siege of Dole and to send him part of his forces. This prince, expecting great results from a mine which he had laid under one of the bastions of the citadel, kept putting off the raising of the siege. At last, the mine having exploded without producing sufficient effect to justify the storming of Dole, Condé complied with the wishes of the king, and on the 15th of August retired with his army in the district of which he was governor. The Duke Charles of Lorraine followed us at the head of 2,000 horse, as far as the entrance of the woods which are on the high road to Auxonne. From our camp to these woods there is a small plain, about 1 league in length, extending between 2 hedges. The regiment of Navarre sent off 100 musketeers towards the right, and my father dispatched as many towards the left. These musketeers kept up firing upon the cavalry of the enemy, and then retired to the main body, being replaced by equal numbers. We thus steadily pushed on, and the enemy finally withdrew, having lost a few men and a considerable amount of horses killed or wounded. At that time the general officers did not seem so anxious to distinguish themselves as they have done since. There was not one of them present at this retreat. As soon as we had arrived in Burgundy, 12 regiments of our army were detached to join the army in Picardy. The enemies had made their extraordinary progress. They had taken possession of La Capelle, Le Catelet, Corbie, and Roye, and the king found himself obliged to call out more troops. The city of Paris, besides 500 or 600 horses, had made him a present of 3 regiments of infantry. The general meeting of the army took place in the plains of Roye. The infantry amounted to 35,000 men, and the cavalry to 15,000. The first exploit was the siege of the town. For the space of 4 years the war continued thus in the Netherlands, in Italy, and in Germany. Cardinal de la Valette made himself master in 1637 of Cateau-Cambrésis, Landrecies, and Maubeuge. In 1638 another dignitary of the Church, Surdis, Archbishop of Bordeaux, destroyed a Spanish fleet near Fuenterrabia, and ravaged repeatedly the coasts of Spain and of southern Italy. The most brilliant successes, however, occurred on the Rhine. Bernard of Saxe-Weimar defeated the imperialists at Rheinfeld, took prisoner their general, John van Weert, and carried Breisach by storm after 3 victories. He was thinking of assuming the sovereignty of Alsace and Breisgau when he died, very opportunely for Louis XIII, who inherited his conquests and his army, 1639. The province of Artois then belonged to the Spaniards. It was invaded during the next campaign by 3 marshals, Le Meilleraye, Chatillon, and Chaulnes, who laid siege to Arras. Bec and Lambois, at the head of an army of 30,000 men, hastened to relieve the city. The French marshals were divided in their opinion. One wanted to stay within the entrenched lines, another thought it more advisable to offer battle to the enemy. Richelieu, being called upon to decide, said: "Gentlemen, when the king gave you the command of the army, it was because he thought you capable. You may leave the lines or not as you please, but you shall answer with your heads for the taking of the town." A few days afterwards the Spaniards were defeated, and Arras compelled to surrender, August 1640. It was the second province wrested from the House of Austria. The French forces were busy at the same time in northern Italy. After the death of Victor Amadeus in 1640, his brothers, Prince Thomas of Carignano and the Cardinal Maurice, backed by a Spanish army, had endeavoured to deprive of the regency Christina, daughter of Henry IV. of France and widow of the late Duke. The Duchess Christina was neither strong enough to defend herself, nor confident enough to give over to the French the fortified positions which they asked. It was not until she had been driven from Turin by the Spaniards that she went to Grenoble for the purpose of asking the help of the king, her brother. She made up her mind to place under the protection of France both Savoy and the few fortresses remaining to her, and thus saved herself from complete political ruin. Instead of his friend Cardinal de la Valette, who had just died, Richelieu sent into Piedmont Count d'Harcourt, an accomplished general, but who had not yet enjoyed an opportunity of giving on the field of battle the measure of his talents. Cadet la Perle, such was d'Harcourt's nickname, because he was a younger son, cadet, of the family of Lorraine Elbeuf, and wore a pearl as an earring, relieved Casale, and with a body of 8,000 men alone defeated before Turin 20,000 Spaniards. We are told that the Marquis of Leganez, when sending him the usual message for the exchange of the prisoners, added: "If I was King of France, I would have Count d'Harcourt beheaded for venturing upon a battle against forces so much superior to his own." "If I were King of Spain," answered d'Harcourt, "I would have the Marquis of Leganez beheaded for allowing himself to be beaten by an army weaker than his own." The Count d'Harcourt obtained a second success over the Spaniards before Casale, broke through their lines, approached Turin, besieged it, and compelled it to capitulate after a resistance which lasted 3 months. This siege is remarkable by a fact which, says M. Weiss, is unique in the annals of military science. Prince Thomas of Savoy, master of the town, besieged the citadel which was occupied by the French, and was himself besieged by d'Harcourt, whose camp was surrounded by the forces of Leganez. The success of this expedition was mainly due to the skill of Turenne, who, triumphing over all obstacles, contrived to send provisions to the French. However, Count d'Harcourt obtained great and deserved glory by his courage. In 1641 he defeated the Cardinal of Savoy before Ivrea. compelled Prince Thomas to raise the siege of Sivas, and made himself master of Coni. The authority of the regent Christina was thus re established, and the princes of Savoy brought back into an alliance with France (1640 1642). Count d'Harcourt received in 1643 orders to protect the provinces of Picardy and Artois, and he was subsequently despatched by Louis XIII. To England for the purpose of mediating between Charles I. and the Parliament. We shall find him later on mixed up with the events of the Fronde. Spain, busily occupied in defending itself against the rebels of Portugal and Catalonia, could not afford to send its troops out of the peninsula (1640). Richelieu had sometimes, but erroneously, been supposed to have connived at the revolution which placed Juan de Braganza on the throne of Portugal. This event and the rising were, however, worth the gain of battles to France, as M. Michelet has very well remarked. At any rate, the Cardinal helped the new king, and persuaded the Catalans to acknowledge Louis XIII. As Count of Barcelona and of Roussillon. A French army commanded by La Motte Houdancourt drove the Spaniards from Catalonia. Another one under the king himself took Perpignan, and added to France the province or district of Roussillon, which has belonged to it ever since September 1641. Thus deprived of the assistance of Spain, Austria had less chance of success. In 1631 the Swedes had been compelled to retire into Pomerania in consequence of the battle of Nordlingen and of the Elector of Saxony's defeat. Thanks to the timely intervention of France, Banner, who was surnamed the Second Gustavus, took the offensive in 1636 and defeated the Imperialists at Wittstock. He routed them again at Chemnitz (1639), marched into Bohemia, and, assisted by Count de Guebriant, one of the most celebrated tacticians of the day, he very nearly carried off at Ratisbon in 1631 both the Diet of the Empire and the Emperor himself. He had crossed the Danube on the ice. A sudden thaw saved Ferdinand III., and shortly afterwards death delivered him of his formidable adversary, while Banner's successor, the renowned Torstensson, so paralysed that he had to be carried in a litter at the head of his army, astonished Europe by the rapidity of his operations, and by a series of glorious victories in Silesia and Saxony. Guebriant led the Weimarian army into the western provinces of the Empire. He defeated Piccolomini at Wolfenbüttel (1641), and Lambois at Kempen in the electorate of Cologne. It was in the middle of these successes that the hand of death struck down Richelieu. On the 21st of June 1642, the Gazette de France had published the following news without any commentary: "The King has arrested the Marquis de Saint-Mars, Grand Equerry of France." On the 2nd of December, not quite 6 months after, the inhabitants of Paris were informed also by the Gazette that public prayers were ordered in all churches for the health of the Cardinal. The King immediately came from Saint Germain to see the minister. He found him quite conscious of his sinking state and prepared to die. "I have this satisfaction," he said, "that I have never failed in my service to the King, and that I leave his kingdom exalted and his enemies destroyed." He then questioned the physicians. "Monseigneur," said one of them, "in 24 hours you will be dead or cured." "That is speaking to the point," answered the Cardinal, and he sent for the Cure of Saint Eustache, his parish church. When he saw the Holy Eucharist, he said, "There is the judge before whom I shall soon appear. I pray him with all my heart to condemn me if I have had any other aim than the welfare of religion and the interests of the state." The ministering priest having asked him if he forgave his enemies, "I have never had," answered he, "any other enemies except those of the state." He expressed the same thought in his will: "I have loved justice and not vengeance." If I have been severe towards some, it was in order to be kind to all." On the 14th of December 1642, about noon, he expired, leaving Chavigny and Desnoyers, his two secretaries of state, to carry on his grand projects under the direction of Giulio Mazarini, whom he recommended to the king as his successor. The death of the cardinal showed Louis XIII. In an unfavourable light. The selfishness which was his great defect, and the littleness of his character, openly manifested themselves. He expressed no regret at the removal of him to whom his reign owed all its splendour. He seemed, on the contrary, like a prisoner who has just recovered his liberty. At the same time he was wise enough to see that Richelieu's policy was the only safe one. Bouthillier, Chavigny, and Desnoyers were retained in their respective offices, as well as Chancellor Seguier, and on the 5th of December Mazarin took his seat at the council board. A circular letter sent to the governors of the various provinces and the local parliaments informed them that, it having pleased God to call back to himself the Cardinal de Richelieu, the king was determined to keep up and maintain all the establishments decreed during his administration, and to carry on all the projects they had settled together with respect both to home and to foreign affairs, so that there would be no change whatever. A similar message was despatched to the various ambassadors at the foreign courts, and by an act of deference to the advice which Richelieu had given on his dying bed, the royal declaration, signed December 1st, which degraded Monsieur while granting him his pardon, was sent down on the 9th to the Parliament and registered in the midst of a profound silence. However, it was perfectly impossible for Louis XIII. To adhere scrupulously to the statement we have given above. The strain had been everywhere too great, and the present ministers were neither willing nor able to continue it. No general measure, indeed, was proposed with the view of setting at liberty all the persons whom Richelieu had visited with his displeasure, but a good many individual concessions were made, and free pardons granted. Marshals de Vitry and Bassompierre left the Bastille. The Archbishop of Bordeaux received permission to retire to his diocese. The Duc d'Orléans himself was allowed to reappear at court. Meanwhile, the health of the king, which had been declining for some time, finally gave way, and on the 19th of April Chavigny took upon himself the unpleasant duty of informing His Majesty that his days were numbered. If we may believe Madame de Motteville, Louis XIII. Embraced the minister, thanking him warmly for this piece of news, and telling him that he had never felt so much joy in all his life than on hearing he was about to die. The following day he summoned around his bedside at Saint Germain the Queen, his two sons, the Duc d'Orléans, the Prince de Condé, the dukes and peers of the realm, the marshals of France, the cabinet ministers, and all the chief officers of the crown. The deed was then read aloud, appointing Anne of Austria regent, and the Duc d'Orléans lieutenant general of the kingdom under her. They were to be assisted by a council of regency, without whose sanction nothing of importance could be done, and where a majority of votes was indispensable for the carrying out of any weighty measure. The council was composed of the Prince de Condé, Mazarin, the Chancellor, Bouthillier, and Chavigny. On the 14th of May, 1643, Louis XIII. Died, 30 years day for day, and almost hour for hour, after his accession to the throne. End of Section 14.